The early morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Morrison's well-kept front lawn as he slowly rocked in his favorite wooden chair on the porch. At 93 years old, his movements were careful but deliberate, much like everything else he did in life. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, rested gently on the arms of the chair that his late wife Martha had given him for their 50th anniversary, 15 years ago. Every morning followed the same peaceful routine in his suburban neighborhood. Frank would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., a habit he couldn't shake from his military days in World War II. He would make his coffee the old-fashioned way, letting it drip slowly through a paper filter, filling his small kitchen with the rich aroma that reminded him of peaceful mornings with Martha. The modest white house with blue shutters stood out in the neighborhood, not because it was fancy, but because it was so perfectly maintained. The garden, Frank's pride and joy, bloomed with colorful flowers that Martha had first planted decades ago. He had promised her on her deathbed that he would keep them alive, and Frank Morrison never broke a promise. Mrs. Chen, his next-door neighbor for the past 12 years, would wave to him as she collected her morning newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she would call out, and Frank would tip his worn blue baseball cap in response. The cap, bearing the insignia of his old military unit, was as much a part of him as his memories of the Pacific Theater. After his porch time, Frank would spend an hour tending to his garden. His old bones might protest, but the routine kept him going. The neighborhood children would often stop to watch him work, fascinated by the old man who knew the name of every flower and plant. He would tell them stories about each bloom, secretly mixing in tales from his war days, making the flowers part of his history. At 9 o'clock a.m. sharp, Frank would clean up and walk the 3 blocks to Sally's diner. The walk took longer than it used to, but he refused to give it up. His wooden cane, carved with the dates of his military service, tapped steadily against the sidewalk as he made his way down Cedar Street. The local kids had learned to recognize the sound, often running out to walk alongside him, eager for one of his stories. Sally's diner had been his breakfast spot for the past 20 years. The owner, Sally Thompson, had taken over from her father and kept Frank's usual booth reserved, the one by the window with a clear view of the street. "The usual, Frank?" Sally would ask, even though she knew the answer. 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, and a side of hash browns. As Frank sat in his booth that morning, sunlight streaming through the window caught the medals displayed proudly on his old military jacket. He only wore the jacket on special days, but today marked the anniversary of his landing at Guadalcanal. Young customers would sometimes stare at the medals, and Frank would gladly explain what each one meant, his voice growing stronger as he shared stories of brotherhood and courage. Regular customers knew Frank's schedule so well that they often timed their visits to coincide with his. They loved hearing his stories, especially about his late wife Martha and his time in the Pacific. He never bragged about his achievements, instead focusing on the bravery of his fellow soldiers and the love that waited for him back home. That particular morning, as Frank finished his breakfast, he noticed how peaceful everything seemed. The street outside was quiet, with just the occasional car passing by, the diner's regular sounds, clinking plates, quiet conversations, and the sizzle of the grill created a comfortable atmosphere he had grown to love. Little did Frank know that this peaceful morning would be one of his last quiet ones. Change was coming to his small corner of the world, and it would arrive with the roar of engines and the clash of 2 very different kinds of people. But for now, he simply enjoyed his coffee, watched the world go by through the diner's window, and smiled at the memory of Martha, who would have loved this perfect morning just as much as he did. The peace of Cedar Street shattered one warm Tuesday afternoon when the first motorcycles roared into the neighborhood. Frank Morrison was trimming his rose bushes when the sound made him jump, nearly cutting himself with the garden shears. 5 large black motorcycles pulled up to the old Peterson building across the street, their engines so loud that the windows of Frank's house rattled. The Peterson building had been empty for months after the small grocery store closed down. Now, Frank watched as a group of rough-looking men in leather vests began unloading boxes from a truck that followed them. A crude hand-painted sign went up over the door, "Road Warriors MC Clubhouse." Mrs. Chen hurried over to Frank's yard, wringing her hands nervously. "Mr. Morrison, did you know about this?" she asked, raising her voice over the rumbling engines. Frank shook his head, his weathered face creasing with concern as he watched more motorcycles arrive. Within days, the quiet neighborhood transformed. The bikers came and went at all hours, their loud machines echoing off the buildings. Music blasted from the clubhouse late into the night, and empty beer bottles often littered the sidewalk by morning. The children who used to play freely on the street now stayed in their yards, intimidated by the rough crowd that had moved in. Frank's peaceful morning routine suffered the most. The noise made it impossible to enjoy his porch time, and his garden began to show signs of neglect as he found himself staying indoors more often. Even his walks to Sally's diner became stressful, as he had to pass by groups of bikers who would laugh and rev their engines as he walked by. Sally's diner changed too. The bikers started coming in for breakfast, taking up the large corner booth. Their loud voices and crude language drove away some of the regular customers. Sally tried to keep the peace, but Frank could see the worry in her eyes as she served the new crowd. "It's not right, Frank," Sally whispered one morning as she refilled his coffee cup. "The Thompson family 2 doors down from you already put their house up for sale. They've lived here for 20 years. Frank nodded sadly, watching through the window as another group of motorcycles pulled up outside. The leader of the group, a tall man with a shaved head and a thick beard, caught Frank's eye through the window. The man, whom the others called Razor, smirked and deliberately revved his engine, making the diner's windows shake. Frank's coffee spilled slightly, leaving a brown rain on the white tablecloth. That evening, as Frank tried to salvage his drought-stressed petunias, 3 motorcycles parked right in front of his house. The riders, including Razor, sat on their bikes smoking and talking loudly. The smoke drifted into Frank's garden, making him cough. "Hey, old-timer," Razor called out with fake friendliness. "Nice flowers you got there. Be a shame if something happened to them." The other bikers laughed, and Frank felt his hands shake slightly as he gripped his garden trowel tighter. Mrs. Chen watched from her window as Frank slowly stood up, using his cane for support. Without saying a word, he walked back into his house, closing the door behind him. That night, the bikers stayed outside until midnight, their laughter and engine noise making it impossible for Frank to sleep. As he lay in bed, looking at the photo of Martha on his nightstand, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since his days in the Pacific, a deep sense of helplessness. The neighborhood he and Martha had chosen for their retirement, the peaceful street where they had planned to grow old together, was slipping away. But Frank Morrison wasn't just any elderly man. Behind his quiet demeanor and gentle gardening habits lay the heart of a warrior who had faced worse odds in his younger days. As he finally drifted off to sleep, his mind began forming a plan. He might be 93, but he had learned long ago that age was just a number, and respect wasn't something you could demand with noise and intimidation. It had to be earned. After a week of sleepless nights and constant noise, Frank Morrison decided enough was enough. He put on his old military jacket, the one with his service medals carefully pinned to the front, grabbed his cane, and walked slowly but purposefully across the street to the motorcycle club. It was mid-morning, and several bikers lounged outside the clubhouse, drinking coffee and working on their motorcycles. The strong smell of cigarette smoke and motor oil filled the air. As Frank approached, conversation stopped, and all eyes turned to watch the old veteran make his way toward them. Razor stepped out from the clubhouse door, wiping his hands on an old rag. He wore a black leather vest covered in patches, and a mocking smile spread across his face as he watched Frank approach. "Well, look who decided to join the party," Razor called out, causing several of his friends to snicker. Frank stood as straight as his old back would allow, his cane planted firmly on the ground. "Good morning," he said politely but firmly. "I'd like to have a word with whoever's in charge here." His voice was steady, carrying the same authority it had held when he commanded troops decades ago. "You're looking at him, old-timer," Razor replied, spreading his arms wide. "What can we do for you? Need some gardening tips?" More laughter erupted from the group. Frank took a deep breath. "I come to talk about the noise and the mess. This is a residential neighborhood with families and children. We've always been peaceful here, and I'm asking you, respectfully, to keep the noise down and clean up after yourselves." The laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Razor walked closer to Frank, towering over him. "Respectfully," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me tell you something about respect, old man. See these patches?" He pointed to his vest. "Each one of these means something. They mean I've earned my place. What have you earned except a bunch of old medals for a war nobody cares about anymore?" Frank's grip tightened on his cane, but his voice remained calm. Those medals represent sacrifice and honor. Things that never go out of style, young man. One of the younger bikers in the group shifted uncomfortably, but Razor wasn't finished. He picked up an empty beer can and tossed it onto Frank's lawn. "Here's what I think about your peaceful neighborhood," he sneered. "Times change, old-timer. Maybe it's time for you to move to one of those retirement homes where you can tell your war stories to people who care." Frank looked at the can on his lawn, then back at Razor. "I've faced worse bullies than you in my time, son. They didn't scare me then, and you don't scare me now." Something dangerous flashed in Razor's eyes. He stepped even closer to Frank, his face inches away. "Is that a threat, old man? Because let me tell you something, you don't want to make threats to someone like me." Mrs. Chen, who had been watching from her porch, hurried over. "Mr. Morrison, please come back. I made some fresh cookies," she said, trying to defuse the situation. Frank stood his ground for a moment longer, looking directly into Razor's eyes. Then he turned slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked back toward his house. Behind him, Razor called out, "Sweet dreams, old-timer. Hope our bikes don't keep you up too late." That night, the motorcycles were louder than ever. They circled the block repeatedly, their engines roaring past Frank's house every few minutes. Someone threw more empty cans into his garden, and crude laughter echoed through the darkness. Inside his house, Frank sat in his favorite chair, looking at an old photo album. His fingers traced over a picture of his old military unit, young faces smiling back at him from a time when the world seemed clearer, when right and wrong were easier to define. Next to him on the side table, his telephone sat silent. Frank hadn't used it much since Martha passed away, just for occasional calls to the pharmacy or to order groceries. But now, as the motorcycles roared past again, he looked at it thoughtfully. In his mind, a plan was forming, one that would require him to reach out to old friends he hadn't spoken to in years. The bullies outside might think they had won this round, but Frank Morrison had learned long ago that the first battle isn't always the deciding one. As another motorcycle roared past his window, he reached for the phone book buried in his desk drawer, a determined smile crossing his weathered face. The week after Frank's confrontation with Razor turned into a nightmare for Cedar Street. The bikers seemed to take Frank's attempt to reason with them as a personal challenge, and they made sure everyone knew it, especially the old veteran. Every morning, Frank would find new damage to his property. On Monday, his mailbox lay on the ground, knocked over by what looked like a bike tire. When he tried to set it back up, his arthritic hands struggled with the screws and nails. Mrs. Chen's teenage son came over to help, but by the next morning, the mailbox was down again. "You should call the police, Mr. Morrison," Mrs. Chen urged as she watched Frank pick up beer cans from his flower beds for the third time that week. But Frank knew better. The local police had already visited twice, but without proof of who was causing the damage, they could do nothing except file reports that would gather dust at the station. Officer Thompson, Sally's nephew from the diner, stopped by regularly to check on Frank. "We're doing what we can, sir," he explained apologetically. "But unless we catch them in the act." He left the sentence unfinished, his frustration evident. The bikers grew bolder with each passing day. They started parking their motorcycles on the edge of Frank's lawn, killing the grass beneath their kickstands. Sometimes they would sit there for hours, playing loud music and making crude comments whenever Frank came outside. One afternoon, as Frank tried to water his dying garden, Razor and his friends decided to wash their bikes right in front of his house. They splashed soapy water everywhere, letting it run into Frank's flower beds. The soap burned the delicate petals of Martha's favorite roses, turning them brown within hours. "Oops," Razor called out with fake concern. "Looks like your flowers don't like bath time, old-timer." His friends laughed, revving their engines to drown out any response Frank might have made. Sally's diner became Frank's only refuge, but even that changed. The bikers started showing up during his usual breakfast time, taking over nearby tables. They would bump his chair as they passed, spilling his coffee or making his toast fall to the floor. Sally would quickly bring him fresh servings, her eyes filled with worry and anger. "I could ban them," Sally whispered one morning as she cleaned up yet another accidentally spilled coffee. But Frank shook his head. He had seen the way the bikers looked at the diner's large windows, and he couldn't let Sally's business become their next target. The other residents of Cedar Street started avoiding Frank, not out of unkindness but fear. Parents would hurry their children past his house, trying to avoid the bikers who seemed to always be there. The Thompson family's house sold for well below market value, and the new owners never even moved in, choosing to rent it out instead. One night, Frank sat in his darkened living room, unable to sleep because of the constant motorcycle noise outside. He looked at the wall where his military photos hung, including one of them receiving a medal for bravery under fire. The young soldier in that photo had faced down enemy forces without flinching. Now, decades later, he was being driven from his home by a group of bullies who had no respect for anything or anyone. His hands shook slightly as he lifted Martha's picture from the side table. "What would you do, my love?" he whispered to her smiling image. Martha had always been the stronger one, he thought. She would know how to handle this situation. As if in response to his question, a rock suddenly crashed through his front window, sending glass shards across the floor. Frank carefully made his way to the broken window, hearing laughter and motorcycles speeding away in the darkness. Among the glass on his floor lay a crumpled piece of paper. When he carefully smoothed it out, he read the crude message. "Too deaf to hear our bikes. Maybe this will get your attention." That's when Frank noticed something else among the broken glass. Martha's picture frame had been hit, the glass cracked right across her smiling face. As he carefully picked up the damaged photo, his hands stopped shaking. A different kind of strength filled him, the kind he hadn't felt since his days in uniform. Frank looked at his phone, then at his old address book sitting in the desk drawer. The time for enduring was over. Tomorrow, he would make a call that would change everything. The morning after the rock incident started like any other, with Frank carefully sweeping up the broken glass from his floor. His neighbor Mrs. Chen had helped him tape cardboard over the broken window until the repair company could come. The damaged photo of Martha sat on his desk, waiting to be reframed. As Frank finished his cleanup, something caught his eye through the cardboard-covered window. A group of bikers had gathered outside the clubhouse earlier than usual. Razor stood in the center, gesturing animatedly as he talked. Even from inside his house, Frank could see the man's satisfied smirk. Following his normal routine despite the previous night's events, Frank put on his military jacket and decided to check his mailbox. But as he stepped onto his porch, he froze. The sight before him made his old heart skip a beat. His flagpole, the one that had stood in his front yard for 40 years, lay flat on the ground. The American flag that had draped the coffin of his best friend James "Jimmy" Sullivan at his funeral after Guadalcanal was crumpled in the dirt, torn and stained with what looked like motorcycle oil. This wasn't just any flag. Jimmy had saved Frank's life during a Japanese attack, pushing him into a foxhole seconds before a grenade exploded. Jimmy didn't make it. Before shipping his body home, the eunuch had performed a ceremony, and Frank had promised Jimmy's widow he would keep the flag safe forever. Frank's hands trembled as he knelt down, his old knees protesting, to lift the flag from the mud. Across the street, he heard Razor's loud voice. "Looks like the wind was pretty strong last night, boys," followed by cruel laughter. Something changed in Frank at that moment. The flag in his hands wasn't just fabric, it was Jimmy's sacrifice, Martha's memory, and everything he had fought for. He looked at his reflection in his house window, an old man in a military jacket holding a muddy flag. But in that reflection, he also saw the young Marine who had stormed beaches, fought for freedom, and never backed down from protecting what was right. With careful movements, Frank carried the flag inside. He gently laid it on his kitchen table, next to the phone he had been contemplating using. On the wall, a small calendar caught his eye. Today's date, June 6, suddenly registered in his mind. D-Day. While he had served in the Pacific, not Europe, the significance wasn't lost on him. "This ends today," Frank whispered to himself. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his old address book, its leather cover worn from years of use. His fingers, steady now with purpose, flipped through the yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for, a number he hadn't called in years. Outside, the bikers had started their usual morning routine of revving engines and playing loud music. But today, instead of closing his windows to block out the noise, Frank left them open. Let them make their noise. Soon, they would learn what real power sounded like. Frank picked up his phone and dialed the number. As it rang, his eyes moved between Martha's damaged photo and Jimmy's desecrated flag. On the fourth ring, a gruff voice answered. "Mike, this is Frank Morrison," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Yes, at Frank Morrison, from Guadalcanal. He listened for a moment, then continued, "Remember that promise we made? About always having each other's backs? Well, old friend, I need to call in that promise." As Frank explained his situation, you could hear the anger building in Mike's voice. When he described what happened to Jimmy's flag, there was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Mike spoke again, and a small smile crossed Frank's face as he listened. "Yes," he said simply, "tomorrow would be perfect." After hanging up, Frank walked to his window and looked out at the bikers still laughing and joking across the street. Razor caught his eye and gave him a mocking salute. Frank didn't respond. Instead, he turned away and began carefully cleaning Jimmy's flag, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything would change. The old veteran had just made the call that would remind everyone on Cedar Street that true strength isn't measured by the loudness of an engine or the ability to intimidate others. Real power comes from brotherhood, honor, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the defense of freedom. The day after Frank's call to Mike turned into a flurry of activity that the old veteran hadn't experienced since his military days. His phone, usually silent, rang continuously. Each call brought more hope and reminded him of the brotherhood he had almost forgotten. Mike had contacted the Veterans Association immediately after speaking with Frank. By noon, the story of a decorated World War II veteran being harassed by bikers had spread through veteran networks across 3 states. What happened next amazed even Frank. "You won't believe who's coming, Frank," Mike said during one call. "Remember Colonel Hayes? Well, he's General Hayes now, and he's bringing the whole Patriot Riders chapter with him. That's just the beginning." Frank sat in his favorite chair, keeping a small notebook to track all the calls. The names brought back memories. Thompson from Charlie Company, Rodriguez from Supply, Baker from Communications, men he'd served with or met through veteran organizations over the years. Each one promised to come, and each one was bringing others. Across the street, the bikers noticed the unusual number of calls Frank was receiving. Through his window, he could see Razor watching his house suspiciously. When the mail carrier delivered several express packages to Frank's door that afternoon, Razor sent one of his men to check Frank's trash for clues. Let them wonder, Frank thought with a slight smile. Around 4 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up in front of Frank's house. A tall man in a crisp business suit stepped out. James Sullivan, Jr., his old friend Jimmy's son, now a prominent lawyer. "Uncle Frank," James said, hugging the old veteran carefully. "Why didn't you call sooner? Dad would have never let this happen." He looked at his father's damaged flag, now carefully cleaned and folded on Frank's table, and his face hardened. James spread several documents on Frank's kitchen table. "I got satellite images showing their vehicles on your property," he explained. "Police reports, noise violations, property damage estimates. More than enough for restraining orders and civil suits. But first, let's see how tomorrow goes." The mysterious activity at Frank's house made the bikers nervous. That evening, instead of their usual harassment, they held a meeting in their clubhouse. Through the growing darkness, Frank could see them gesturing and arguing through the windows. Around midnight, Frank's phone rang one final time. "Everything's set," Mike's voice came through clearly. "Operation Cedar Street is ready to roll. You just be on your porch at 900 hours tomorrow. And Frank, wear your medals. All of them." As Frank prepared for bed that night, he heard a motorcycle start up across the street. Through his window, he watched Razor make a call while pacing back and forth. The biker's face showed concern as he spoke urgently into his phone. Word had gotten out that something was happening, but the bikers had no idea what was coming. Frank took out his old uniform from the back of his closet. It didn't fit anymore, but his medals still shone as brightly as ever. He pinned each one carefully to his best jacket, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and all the others. Each medal told a story of sacrifice, courage, and brotherhood. Before going to bed, Frank walked to his kitchen and looked at Jimmy's flag one more time. "We kept our promises in the war," he whispered to the memory of his friend. "And we keep them now." That night, for the first time in weeks, the street was quiet. The bikers, unsettled by the day's mysterious events, had parked their motorcycles and gone home early. In the silence, Frank slept peacefully, dreaming of his days in uniform, of friends made and lost, and of promises kept through the decades. His last thought before drifting off was of Martha. He could almost hear her voice. Show them what a real man is, Frank Morrison. Show them what honor looks like. In the darkness, his medals gleamed on his jacket, ready for one more mission. Tomorrow would bring something the bikers had never seen before. The true meaning of brotherhood and the power of promises made by men who had faced death together on distant shores. Little did Razor and his gang know, but their world was about to change forever, all because they had pushed a quiet old veteran too far. At exactly 8:45 a.m., Frank Morrison stepped onto his front porch wearing his metal-decorated jacket. The morning was unusually quiet, no motorcycles, no loud music, just the sound of birds singing in his garden. Across the street, Razor and about 20 of his bikers stood nervously outside their clubhouse, trying to look tough, but constantly checking their phones. Mrs. Chen came out of her house with a cup of coffee for Frank. "Something's happening today, isn't it?" she whispered. Frank just smiled and checked his watch again. At 8:55 a.m., a low rumble started in the distance. At first, it sounded like thunder, but it kept growing louder and stronger. Razor and his men looked around, confused by the building sound that seemed to come from all directions. Then, at exactly 9:00 a.m., they appeared. From every street leading to Cedar Street came motorcycles, hundreds of them, but these weren't ordinary bikes. These were ridden by veterans in military-style vests covered with service patches. American flags flew from many of the bikes, creating a sea of red, white, and blue. The Patriot Riders had arrived. Leading the parade was General Hayes himself on a massive black motorcycle, wearing his dress uniform. Behind him came row after row of riders. Retired Marines, Army veterans, Navy SEALs, Air Force pilots, all answering the call to help one of their own. The sound was deafening as over 300 motorcycles circled Cedar Street, then parked in perfect formation around Frank's house. Razor and his gang stood frozen, their faces pale as they watched the military precision of the operation. General Hayes dismounted his bike and walked up to Frank's porch. He snapped a crisp salute, which Frank returned. Staff Sergeant Morrison, the general's voice boomed across the suddenly quiet street. "Charlie Company, Pacific Theater, reporting as requested, sir." Behind him, hundreds of veterans stood at attention next to their bikes. Mike, Frank's old friend, stepped forward with Jimmy's son James. They carefully carried a new flagpole, complete with a mechanism that would make it impossible to pull down. "Uncle Frank," James called out, his voice carrying clearly, "Dad's flag will fly again, and this time, it's got some protection." He nodded toward the hundreds of veterans who stood ready. Razor, trying to maintain some control of the situation, started walking toward Frank's house. He stopped short when he found his path blocked by 6 enormous Marines, each wearing vests identifying them as members of the Devil Dogs Motorcycle Club. "Going somewhere?" one of them asked quietly, crossing his tattooed arms. General Hayes turned to address Razor directly. "Son, let me explain something to you," he said, his voice stern but calm. "The man whose property you've been vandalizing, he saved my life in Guadalcanal. The flag you destroyed? It belonged to a hero who died protecting his brothers. Every man and woman you see here, they're family. And we protect our family." Frank stepped down from his porch, walking steadily without his cane. The morning sun caught his medals, making them shine. The veterans parted to create a path as he walked toward Razor. The biker gang leader, who had seemed so threatening just yesterday, now looked small surrounded by real warriors. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like fear. "Young man," Frank said clearly, "you wanted to talk about respect. Well, take a look around. Every person here earned their respect through sacrifice and service, not by making noise and scaring old folks and children." One of the younger members of Razor's gang suddenly stepped forward, removing his leather vest. "I'm out, Razor," he said. "My grandfather served in Vietnam. I can't be part of this anymore." 3 more bikers followed his lead, backing away from their former leader. Razor looked around at the wall of veterans surrounding him, at his shrinking group of followers, and at Frank Morrison standing tall in his decorated jacket. For the first time since arriving on Cedar Street, the bully had nothing to say. The message was clear. Cedar Street was under new protection, and these protectors weren't going anywhere. The brotherhood forged in war had come together one more time, showing that true strength isn't about making noise or causing fear. It's about standing together and protecting what's right. 1 month after the Patriot Riders' arrival, Cedar Street had transformed back into a peaceful neighborhood, but with some surprising changes. The old Peterson building still housed a motorcycle club, but not the one everyone expected. Frank sat in his usual spot at Sally's Diner, enjoying his morning coffee. Through the window, he could see the building's new sign: Veterans Motorcycle Club, Cedar Street Chapter. The street outside was clean, quiet, and lined with well-maintained motorcycles that only roared to life after 9 a.m. "More coffee, Frank?" Sally asked, smiling as she watched 3 former members of Razor's gang carefully washing the club's windows. After leaving their old leader, these young men had discovered that several of them had veterans in their families. Now, under the mentorship of the Patriot Riders, they were learning about real brotherhood. The biggest surprise had been Razor himself. The day after the veterans' arrival, he had returned alone to Frank's house. This time, instead of a smirk, he carried something else: an old photograph of a man in military uniform. "This was my grandfather," Razor had explained, his tough guy facade cracking. "He served in Korea, but I never knew him. When I saw all those veterans standing together yesterday, I finally understood what he was part of." That conversation had lasted 2 hours, with Frank sharing stories of service and sacrifice that Razor had never heard before. Now, Razor's motorcycle was often seen parked outside the VA hospital where he had started volunteering. His leather vest still had patches, but among them was a new one that read "Proud Grandson of a Korean War Veteran." The neighborhood kids, no longer afraid to play outside, would stop by the Veterans Club to hear stories. Every afternoon, different veterans would share their experiences, teaching young people about honor, respect, and the true meaning of courage. Frank's garden became a favorite gathering spot, where he taught both children and reformed bikers about patience and growth. Mrs. Chen's flower shop flourished with new customers from the veterans community. She had even started a special display of red, white, and blue arrangements in her window. The Thompson family, who had sold their house, asked to cancel the rental agreement and move back, saying the neighborhood felt more like home than ever. Every Saturday morning, a group of Patriot Riders would arrive to check on Frank and the other residents. They had become a regular part of the community, their presence a reminder that sometimes the strongest forces for good come wrapped in leather and chrome. Jimmy's flag flew proudly on the new pole in Frank's yard, now surrounded by fresh flowers planted by both veterans and former troublemakers working together. At its base, a small plaque told Jimmy's story, ensuring his sacrifice would never be forgotten. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard a familiar rumble. A group of motorcycles approached, but instead of fear, the sound now brought comfort. Razor led the group, which included several of his former gang members, all wearing their new veterans support patches. They parked their bikes and walked up to Frank's porch, carrying something covered with a cloth. "Mr. Morrison," Razor said respectfully, "we've been working on this for a few weeks." He unveiled a beautifully crafted wooden bench, built to replace Frank's old rocking chair. "The wood is from the old flagpole," one of the young men explained. "We wanted to turn something that represented disrespect into something honorable." Frank ran his hand over the smooth wood, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into making it. Martha would have loved it, he thought, and somewhere, Jimmy was probably smiling too. As the sun set on Cedar Street, Frank sat on his new bench, surrounded by an unlikely family of veterans and reformed bikers. The evening air carried the scent of his blooming garden, and somewhere down the street, a motorcycle started up, not in defiance or intimidation, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes come from unexpected places. The old veteran looked at his neighborhood, peaceful, strong, and more alive than ever, and smiled. Sometimes it takes a storm to remind people of what really matters: respect, honor, and the unbreakable bonds of true brotherhood.